For most people in this country, this image doesn't need much of an introduction. But for everyone else, this was a campaign poster for the UK Independence Party in favour of Britain leaving the EU in June this year. As soon as it was released, along with the photos of a smiling UKIP leader, Nigel Farage, posing in front of it, smiling away, a strong reaction followed. And although this kind of image wasn't rare amongst the mass of right-wing propaganda that was coming out at the time, it did make one thing clear once again, and that is that race is an issue in modern-day Britain. This representation uses some of the strongest tactics to incite fear and panic imaginable, by showing a stream, or swarm, as they would call it in the media, of non-white males treading the supposed green grasses of Europe, ready to invade and wreak havoc. As a result, it takes away any form of individuality, specificity, or complexity of the situation or the individuals themselves. This image ultimately just becomes one thing, and that is a racial representation of threat that is then repeated again and again. By default, then, the division between us and them just grows wider. Them. There's so many questions about them. Who are they? Why are they here? And why they're an issue? But what about us? Who is the us? Who is included in the us? And are we a problem? Hi, my name is Ali, and for this talk, I'm talking to you about the concept of whiteness and white culture. Something that by default I am part of, as you can see, but something that internally I've always struggled with a lot inside, as you may not be able to see. When I talk about whiteness, I'm talking about a system that was established by and for the white race a long time ago, that has been reinforced again and again, and is now prevalent in this country, in Europe, and in the West. I'm talking about a system that holds mass power and control over the media representations that we see every single day. And I'm talking about a system that shows that ultimately whiteness is absolutely everywhere, but so much so that it is invisible. When I say invisible, I mean because when whiteness talks about race, it never mentions itself. Whiteness is not labelled, it is not categorized, barely stereotyped in a serious way at least, and even less analysed. Theorist Richard Dyer stated, "Whiteness is not being simply of a certain race, but simply of the human race." That's how Western society paints it. And so much so that this then begins to be internalised. Being white is not an issue for most white people, not a conscious or reflected on part of their sense of who they are. So if we're to go back to our image here, and if this were to be a stream or swarm of white males, I think we can agree that the questions or assumptions on it would be significantly different, perhaps about their economic status, political affiliation, or specific nationality. But alone, just their race would say nothing, because in white culture, whiteness means nothing. Now, as I've said, I've got a little bit of an unstable positioning on this subject. Yes, you can read me as white straight away. I'm treated that way, and I'm also part of a system that has benefited me because of that through privilege. But I inhabit an in-between zone, in between otherness and whiteness. I identify as mixed Latin American British, and my identity is one of a hybrid of cultures, a mixing of two entities. But I became very aware at a young age how my image was always been constructed for me, how it was almost imposed on me. At first glance, when you see me or when you hear my voice, most people don't associate any other experience of otherness with me. But I also then became aware of how people's perceptions of me would change as I would switch between languages or change my cultural mannerisms. But most importantly, I also realized how people from my background, my culture, and my identity, which I feel so strongly about, would be discriminated and excluded in society, yet I would be treated completely different simply because of my paler complexion. So for me, my whiteness became more and more visible, my white privilege more of an issue. And so I thought, this is something that society has to talk about, it has to confront. And I realized actually no one was really confronting it. Why weren't people talking about it? I realized it's because whiteness teaches you never to really question it, tries to make it seem as if it's not a problem in society. But why is this an issue? You might be wondering, what is the problem in whiteness being invisible? Representations hold such a strong place in this world. They shape our assumptions and knowledge on people, place, and time. And in a society where a fear of difference is gathering momentum, we can see in the rise of Donald Trump, in Brexit, and in the general rise of the right wing. I believe that these representations are now more important than ever in challenging assumptions and institutional bias and division. But as whiteness continues to just stay within this system that paints it as natural and normal, the divisions just stay in place. When whiteness stays invisible, it maintains its privilege, and it is the other that will always bear the brunt of this. One of the clearest examples of this, of whiteness's invisibility, can be seen in the lack of labelling of white terrorism, which now is beginning to be noticed, the hypocrisy of attributing certain actions to someone's race or religion, where white people just get the mental health lone wolf tag. As a result, whiteness or white terrorism isn't then really seen as a threat to society. It's not really like an issue that we have to face. But in fact, research in 2015 from the US, post 9/11, showed that more acts of terror were committed by white terrorists than any other group. Of course, any act of terror is to be condemned by whoever it's done by, but in staying focused on the lack of labelling and representation of this, we can begin to see what being invisible really means. Ultimately, a white person can do whatever they want and it won't be attributed to their race. But as society always seeks someone to blame, it is the other that will be further stigmatized. Whiteness continues to disassociate itself from this idea of race through the ideology of colorblindness, this idea of seeing beyond race or being anti-racist in that way. Yet we also know that is a little bit more complicated. I remember being younger when I just arrived back in this country, and I'd forgotten all my English. I felt very distant from being British, and the kind of idea of being British was new to me again. And I remember watching TV and seeing just non-stop white, British, or American affluent people. And I at least looked like these people. I mean, in appearance-wise, I could identify. But there was something that made me feel detached. And I wondered how anyone who looked even remotely different or had a different identity could relate. I asked my mum, I said to her, is this an issue? I mean, I don't know if this is just something I'm making up in my head, or I don't know. And she just kind of looked at me and said, Ali, we don't talk about that here. For me, that's what colorblindness was and is now. This idea of sort of almost turning a blind eye to the issues that minorities have to face on a daily basis. Whiteness here turns a blind eye to the importance of representation, of diversity, and of the consequences of its own invisibility. But what are the consequences of invisibility? What happens after so much time of whiteness being invisible? We can see in one of the most crucial but also controversial movements of our time, Black Lives Matter. Its crucial message is now being constantly shot down by the counter-argument that all lives matter, which was based on the thought that the original protest meant only Black Lives Matter, brackets, white don't. Here we can see invisibility almost shifting into an ugly form of almost jealousy, because in being invisible and seeing others speak up for themselves and represent themselves, whiteness begins to feel excluded, left out, essentially attacked, as if it has to question this power that it never once wanted to consider. So in this case, we see how invisibility actually stops the other from progressing. Yet representations do not only shape how we see those around us, they also shape how we see ourselves. Labels can begin to be internalized, and you position yourself in the world how others might position you. Sociologist Michael Kimmel once stated in a talk he gave about an experience that changed his way of seeing invisibility forever. Two women were in conversation, one black and one white, about the topic of a universal feminism, the idea of one struggle. And the question came up, when you wake up in the morning and look in the mirror, what do you see? To which the white woman replied, I see a woman. The black woman then looked at her and said, see, that's the problem, because when I wake up in the morning and I look in the mirror, I see a black woman. To me, race is visible. To you, it is invisible. And that's what privilege is. Not too long ago, I was speaking to one Latina woman who emigrated to the UK a while back. She relocated to a relatively middle-class white part of the southeast of England. And she arrived into a job that was well below her skills and talent, the typical immigrant story. She went from a difficult situation back home to an even more complicated one here, in a way. But her main sadness was not about her job, a lack of money, or not seeing her family. Her sadness was about the way she was looked at. And she said to me, "People do see me as no more than an immigrant. They don't see past my skin color or my difference. I am just difference here." For her, representations aren't just images that we see every day. Her representation shapes her existence here. Colorblindness isn't an option for her. She lives otherness every single day. So what if white culture were to be as aware and labeling of itself as it is of others? If you, as a white person, were reminded every single day that you are white, how differently might you understand race? This was an image placed outside Temple University in the US in September by artist Cara Springer in response to the racial upheaval taking place over there. White people do something. But what? I ask, if whiteness is part of this problem, can it be part of a solution? You might have wondered, when I first came out here and I started talking to you about race, why it was a small white girl up here discussing this. What do I know about the subject? Well, in that sense, that's a little part of the problem itself, because essentially I contend that everyone should be discussing race. That's not to say that you should speak on someone else's experience. You or I haven't lived in their shoes to be able to experience what they have experienced. But everyone has an experience of race, be it whiteness, otherness, something in between, or whatever. And these are all voices that are important to the conversation. Seeing yourself before you label others. Simply put, by seeing what we are and what we have, we can ask why we have it, why others don't, and what can be done about it. I've had people say to me in discussing this conversation, but whiteness doesn't define me. It's not a big part of who I am, and it never has been. But I would say it is a part of who you are, subconsciously. You've been taught to thought that it's not, but it is there somewhere. And ultimately, white people are a product of white history, of white privilege and opportunity. Even though that can be hard to confront, it is important to do so. Essentially, I'm advocating for you to see color, which at first might sound counterproductive, as society does try to promote this sort of seamless multiculturalism. But seeing color is seeing privilege, and seeing privilege allows you to understand the ways in which society functions to the strong disadvantage of others. So if you walk away from this talk taking away one thing, I ask it be this: acknowledge your position in the world. How does your identity fit into the stories of our time? Because I ask you to look at what the media really tries to make you sometimes forget or even not consider. And in this case, whiteness and the white lie of representation. You can be part in helping to deconstruct this narrative that whiteness is normal and everything else must be labeled or dealt with. You can help deconstructing that by simply analyzing it, questioning it, and taking notice that it's there. Talk about race. It's a discussion that needs to be taking place right now, especially as we see what's going on around us. One of the most important racial thinkers of all time, Frantz Fanon, once said that change does not automatically come from simply understanding, but from action based on aspiration and desire. So if you aspire and desire to do something about our changing times, take a look at yourself in the mirror first. Thank you.